Maura Kenealy and I are going to talk this evening about the Hart sisters. And all I can say at this stage is that they all must be resting very peacefully in their graves, knowing that the excellent archives they helped to establish are being cared for so well by the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. This team is doing remarkable work and is making these archives accessible to all Kilkenny Archaeological Society members and to everyone interested in Kilkenny's history. My plan for this evening is to trace briefly the family backgrounds of the Birch and Harte families, showing their relatively secure and comfortable lives in the 19th century, and then to dwell in more detail on the engagement, wedding and honeymoon of Mollie Birch and James Hart, which leads to the story of their daughters, Mary, Kitty and Rita Hart. As early as 1839, Shearman's directory tells us that Katherine Birch, who was married to a farmer, had a pub in Irishtown where the Cat and Fiddle now stands. The pub is on a corner which was commonly called Kitty or Katty Birch's Corner. At that time, groceries as well as alcohol were sold in a pub, and the family would have lived above the pub. It was a good business to have at that time. This was where Richard Birch, son of Katherine and Martin, set up his own public house in 1861. He took out a lease for 80 years on a pub in Parliament Street, and this turned out to be a good investment. Parliament Street in the 1950s was probably much like it was 100 years earlier, with its small shop fronts and the road narrowing at the entrance to Irishtown. Catherine Hughes came from Keatingstown in County Kilkenny, and her father Patrick was a grocer. She was clearly a handsome woman, and this photo suggests she was a strong character and very capable. She was to need this strength early in her married life to Richard. Their only child, Mary Mollie, was born in September 1873, but on the last day of 1875, tragedy struck the family when Richard died at the age of 37, leaving a 2-year-old baby and a wife who was clearly brokenhearted. However, thanks to Richard's investment in the pub and grocery, she was left comfortably off and continued to run the pub and grocery for the rest of her life. After her husband's death, Katherine immediately set about commemorating as best she could the short life of Richard Birch. Here is his fine tombstone in Three Castles graveyard, with a ringed crosshead inspired by the shape of early medieval high crosses. The inscription reads, "Erected by his sorrowing widow, Katherine Birch." It was carved by Hoban stonemasons of Irishtown in Kilkenny, who were also responsible for 5 tombstones between 1847 and 1927 in Thornback Cemetery, some miles away. Now, look carefully at this photograph and take note of the position of the front position of the face and the detail of the watch chain. This portrait of Richard was probably painted soon after he died, and as my brother Frank observed, appears to have been modelled on the previous photograph. The painting and many other photographs and documents relating to the Hart ancestors are carefully preserved by Maura Kenealy, Mary Hart's daughter-in-law, who will speak to us shortly. Continuing the commemoration of the life of Richard Birch, some years after his death, Katherine remarried, but even then was commemorating Richard and had this stained glass window erected in the Black Abbey. The inscription, when I first read it, I was left wondering why Richard Birch had a stained glass window in his memory erected by a Mrs. Thomas Grace. But of course, Katherine, then wife of Thomas Grace, knew she didn't have to explain to local people that Richard was her beloved first husband. One of the things that struck me in dealing with this family history is that the experience of sad and tragic events is common to everyone, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So most of you here today, this evening, will be familiar with early deaths among your relatives, babies and children dying young, mothers and fathers taken before their time. Life in those days was uncertain. Now we move to the story of the Graces. Katherine and her second husband, Thomas Grace, ran the pub together. She until her death in 1904, and Thomas until his death in 1927, when it passed to Thomas, their son. Now, I've put this photograph here, but I am not at all sure that it is John and Maria Hart, the grandparents of the Hart sisters. It could well be one of their sons, and maybe a closer examination of the costume would help to tell us the date of the photograph. But I'm also wouldn't be surprised if some of the viewers here this evening will be familiar with this photograph and might be able to even offer their advice about identification. But anyway, to tell you the story of John Hart, he was a substantial and prosperous farmer from Castletown, Galmoy in North Kilkenny, with an interest in public service and politics. Maria came from a very wealthy farming family, her father owning huge amounts of land. After their marriage, John and Maria were able to increase their holdings, buying or acquiring additional lands from the Marams. So this important period when the Local Government Act was passed in 1898, it marked an important change in the system of local government in Ireland when the Local Government Act was passed. Grand juries were abolished and replaced by democratically elected county councils. The new system effectively ended landlord control of local government. In 1899, John Hart was elected as one of the first councillors of the newly formed Kilkenny County Council. He had previously served as chairman of the Poor Law Union of North Kilkenny. His electioneering speech in Johnstown was reported in the Kilkenny Moderator when he identified himself as a Parnellite. You can read this speech in the Society's library, where hard and microfilm copies of this and other historic newspapers are carefully preserved. We also know from my mother that her father, James, also supported the ideas of Parnell. In essence, home rule for Ireland, but still within a union with Britain. James Hart qualified as a solicitor in 1896 and set up his practice at 39 Parliament Street, almost opposite Roath House, where the Hart solicitors still practice. He had served as an apprentice with M.M. Murphy of John Street and taken the non-graduate route through the examinations of the Law Society of Ireland. 10 years later, Kilkenny County Council appointed him as their first solicitor and land agent, and this brought him substantial business. James also attracted business from the bigger farmers, the Anglo-Irish, and with his passion for horse racing and breeding horses, a horsey set. He also bought and sold farms and did considerable work for the National Bank, often acting as receiver of bankrupt farms. In 1912, he was appointed public notary. Now we move on to some happy times. Down the street from James's home and office lived Mary Ann or Mollie Birch of 26 Parliament Street. And being neighbours, they may have known each other when growing up. James was 4 years older than Mollie. Mollie was an attractive girl, no doubt inheriting some of the good looks of her mother, Katherine Hughes. And we see her as she grows older. So these last two photographs were taken by the firm of Lafayette, which was set up in Dublin in 1880. That's the photograph of Mollie and James Hart. The Lafayette used to travel by appointment to places like Kilkenny, complete with all their props. Judging from their youthful appearance, the engagement probably took place about 3 years before 1906, the year they married. So this photograph was taken in Wales in Llandudno on their honeymoon. The most striking thing about these photographs is how much James and Mollie seem to have aged since their engagement photograph some years earlier. It certainly is a solemn photograph. At the time of their marriage, James was 37 and Mollie 33. When I saw this photograph, until I saw this photograph, I always wondered why Rita Hart went to school in Llandudno. Maybe it was known for the quality of its art teaching, or perhaps on their honeymoon in Llandudno, they had such a great time in the town that they relished the opportunity to visit it again. Now, here's the family around 1919. And I just show you a detail now which shows Mollie holding in one hand the hand of her youngest daughter, Rita, and in the other, her son, Jim's hand. And now we move, as it were, to Troyes Wood House. In 1914, James and Mollie had begun the process of purchasing Troyes Wood House outside the city on the road to Freshford. The owner, a member of the Bellew family, obviously intended to move to Britain, but delayed completing the sale because of worries about the conscription laws. These were first introduced in Britain in 1916 and might force his son or sons to enlist in what was becoming an horrific war with enormous casualties. At first, Single men between 18 and 41 were conscripted. Later, it was extended to married men and the age limit to 51. In Ireland, conscription was never enforced because of the Irish Rebellion in 1916. Anyway, eventually, the Harts in 1922 moved to Troyes Wood with its estate of some 60 acres, which was ideal for James's ambition to breed horses. Later, John Kerwin, grandfather of today's archivist John Kerwin, trained race horses for James at his stables in Goresbridge. I was delighted recently to come across this advertisement, which I found in Rita's photograph book, and it tells me something about that James Hart actually won some prizes with his horses. I remember one of the horses, this was Golden Link, which was, not only did he win £200 in this race that you can see here, but he also won £100 in the 3 Rock Plate, wherever that took place. I remember one of his horses was called Alvanida and another called Red Helen, which I like to think was named after me, most unlikely, but anyway, Troyes Wood was a great place for children to play, and I remember it as a magical place. There were apple trees like Beauty of Bath growing between box hedging with its very distinctive scent. There were the lovely stables with brass fittings for the horses and the big orchards at the back. By this time, James, following in his father's footsteps of public service, had been elected member of Kilkenny Corporation. Being solicitor to the county council didn't apparently cause any difficulty. The period this was during the Irish War of Independence from 1919, ending with a truce on the 9th of June 1921. 6 months later, on the 6th of December 1921, the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty took place in London, followed, of course, by the Civil War. Now, I'm talking a little bit about the struggle now for women to obtain degree qualifications, which began in the two last decades of the 19th century, the aim being to enable women as well as men to obtain qualifications to earn a living. The Irish Universities Act of 1908 made it easier for women students to obtain degrees and indeed to become staff members of universities. James and Mollie Harte obviously made the decision to educate all their children to 3rd level, not only their eldest child, Jack, seen here, who became a solicitor, but also their daughters. Now, I would very much like to introduce Maura Kenealy to you, who continues the family tradition in her own historical researches. So Maura will now talk to you about 2 of the Hart sisters that she knew so well, Mary Kenealy, her mother-in-law, and Rita Hart. So I'll now vacate this seat.
Greetings to all. The 3 Hart sisters were unique and clearly had a great love of their native Kilkenny. They were all founder members of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, and in 1945 were committed to the restoration when the Archaeological Society was revived in 1945, they were all members and then committed to the restoration of Roath House. They guided the society for many years through various officerships and Old Kilkenny Review articles. They were all skilled researchers and without the advantage of today's technology. In their time, they made hundreds of excursions to the National Archives and to many other history sources. In the first 3 years of their marriage, James and Mollie had 3 children in quick succession. Jack, sitting here at the back, looking very handsome, and Mary on the left-hand side, and Kitty, probably about 2 in this picture, 1909. Mary was educated at the Loretto Convent in Kilkenny and Ursuline Convent, Waterford. She completed a BA degree in 1928. She went on then to study law in UCD, where she was one of only 3 women in a male-dominated class. She graduated in 1934 and worked at first in the offices of Sweetman in Dublin, before returning to Kilkenny to work in the family practice. She was recently celebrated by the Law Society in this beautiful book as being among the first 100 women solicitors who qualified in the new Irish Free State, and is number 25 on this list. In the late 1920s and early 30s, Mary and Kitty accompanied their adventurous mother on foreign travel, including a number of cruises to the British Isles, Europe, North Africa, and which all must have been very exciting for them. And judging by the snaps in their albums, this is so. So we have the pictures here. We have the Irish contingent. We have a picture where Mary and Mollie are on board, participating in some deck games. And here we have where they have visited Casablanca. And finally, they are in Madeira here, and you can see the jolly looks on their faces. And the reason for this is they had just been to a wine tasting session. In her 1940s diary, Mary described her life with the backdrop of World War II. She felt very strongly about the misery in the world. She described her involvement with the Irish Red Cross, with Miss Monks in charge, meeting trains full of refugees, drills where they had to be at their stations within a few hours, and then, of course, complete with uniform, white coat, veil, and Red Cross armlet. Despite all of this, the family enjoyed the long hot summer of 1940. And here we see them enjoying a holiday in Tramore. And you can recognize some of the family members in that. We have Jack in the front, his wife Dorothy, and over to the right-hand side, Kitty and Mary with some friends. In August 1945, at the age of 37, Mary married Con Kenealy, a widower who was editor of the Kilkenny Journal. The wedding picture here shows the best man, Tim Buggy, at the front there, and Rita was bridesmaid. And here we have a detail of the photograph, Mary with her 2 sisters, Kitty and Rita, and their sister-in-law, Dorothy Hart, who was wife of Jack. They had a son, Francis, who died young, unfortunately, and then had Louis in 1951. Mary must have been a very patient mother, as when Louis was a teenager, he and his friends formed a rock band called the Fifth Degree and were allowed to practice at the house. All this practice paid off, however, as they were very popular during the 60s and performed on RTE television on the Like Now programme. Louis and I married then in 1974, and we went on to have 3 children. When Kilkenny Archaeological Society was revived in 1945 with 103 members, soon Mary took an active part. She brought the society on a tour of the walls of Kilkenny in December 1947 and subsequently wrote her first article for the Old Kilkenny Review in 1948. This was the first of 16 articles in the Old Kilkenny Review. To mention a few of her other articles, she wrote a scholarly account of the parish of Harte and the Maura family. This was in the 1976 edition. Another of Mary's great articles was written about the Kilkenny Journal newspaper in 1978, tracing its origins back 200 years to Finn's Leinster Journal in 1767, tracking the newspaper all the way through to 1965 when it ceased operation as a newspaper. The paper had its roots in history, back in the days when Irish politics was dominated by the struggle for land reform. Back then, one reached Kilkenny by stagecoach and there was no street lighting. She writes at length about the Maxwell family, ancestors of the Kenealys, and particularly about the life of William Kenealy. He took over as editor of the paper in the early 1850s. He was a fluent and eloquent speaker, as well as a great writer. He is known also for writing the Kilkenny ballad, as many will know, The Moon Behind the Hill. Strangers remarked when they heard him speak at a public meeting that they had never heard more beautiful language or more exquisite similes. In 1979, Mary, being president of the society, received the bound issues of the Kilkenny Journal for Roadhouse Library from the Kenealy family. This was a gift beyond price. Her last article in 1989 was about the character Francis Walter Donny, who was born in 1879, died in 1962, who was also related to the Kenealys. His mother was Annie Kenealy, eldest daughter of William. Known for his brilliant intellect, he qualified as a solicitor in 1903, obtaining the highest marks in the United Kingdom in his final exam. He was always concerned with the rights of the individual against the state. This is an article well worth reading. Other articles of historical interest were those about Patrick Street, written in 1963 and 1964. All of these articles are available online at the KAS website. Mary loved golf and was later captain of Kilkenny Golf Club in 1948, but her main passion was Kilkenny Archaeological Society. She was its first librarian, and during her time, she developed it into one of national historic reference. She was honorary secretary of 1966 and president of the society from 1976 to 1980. This picture was taken in 1976 at the start of her presidency. She's receiving a 14th century jug from Luke Roach, and he had found this on his farm. Mary was a scholar to her fingertips and an eminent local historian whose research was done with great care and thoroughness. She was dignified, gentle, calm, and caring by nature, self-effacing, but always approachable. Mary surrounded herself with like-minded friends who called regularly to the house, where they were always offered a sherry. But there was one golden rule: never before 6 p.m. The sisters were very close always and would meet regularly in each other's homes for Sunday lunch. I remember Mary's nasi goreng and American icebox pudding so well, going down really well on these occasions. Mary died in her 85th year in April 1993. Rita, The youngest of the three, and a bit more bohemian than her sisters, was born in 1916. She was educated in the Loreto Convent, Kilkenny and Bray, and had also spent some time in Llandudno. After her formal education, she went to Florence to study art, and she returned to Florence later in 1957 for a ceramics course. This is a picture of a necklace that she made for Helen, and Helen is rarely parted from this precious piece. She taught art in the vocational school Kilkenny, Kilkenny College, and the Loreto in Kilkenny. Her pupils were devoted to her, and she inspired them with enthusiasm. In 1999, 9 years after Rita's death, Katherine Marshall, the art historian, curator, and first head of collections at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, gave a talk on Rita to Kilkenny Archaeological Society. A past pupil of Rita's, she recounted with great affection her skills as an art teacher and how she had influenced her by stressing the importance of developing one's own style. Rita, she said, was an unusual and exceptional teacher who advised rather than commanded and drew the best from all her pupils. Some pictures now of Rita's wonderful work. We have here, she spent some time on holidays in the Aran Islands and painted these two pictures. The second one, a detail of the first. But at this lecture, one special painting drew particular interest. The one of these three Irish dancers in traditional costume of the time, with toes pointed at the same angle, ready to leap into the air. A slightly satirical twist, which was often in keeping with Irish artistic endeavour. Katherine compared this painting to a Louis Le Broquet, but she said, better than Louis in its spontaneity. I spoke to her only last week and she reiterated this comment. There were other paintings on display which Rita had done during her travels in Italy and France. And here we have a painting from Rockbrunn. Rita was a skilled cartoonist. In this sketch of a famous incident in Kilkenny Archaeological Society in 1952, the people here are easily identifiable. It characterizes Rita's wit and sense of humor, which she could bring to this serious event. Helen will speak more on this later. Everyone is aware of the marvelous work Rita did in sketching hundreds of tombstones throughout Kilkenny and County. She would go out on her bicycle with her art pad and pen, trimmer, gloves, ground sheet, all in her basket, and slash her way through the overgrowth in these graveyards and clean, obscure inscriptions, usually with fistfuls of grass or dock leaves, and set about doing her sketches. She spent hundreds of hours doing this noble work. One of her poems, The Ancient Graveyard, explains these excursions very well. Some of these sketches are in the Old Kilkenny Review in 1987, in her very fine article on Newtown, and in the book on St. Patrick's published in 1990. The work on St. Patrick's was central to her last year on this earth and demanded her utmost attention. I would like to mention that Rita's gravestone drawings were recently catalogued by the Library Committee in Kilkenny Archaeological Society under Dr. Mary Brennan and added to the database of burials in County Kilkenny. I think there is scope for a fuller publication of Rita's gravestone drawings, along with the history of the churches and graveyards. Rita was a keen amateur actress who served ossuary players well. In 1989, she collected programmes and billheads of plays and concerts in Kilkenny since the early 20th century and bound them in 2 big volumes and presented them to Roadhouse Library. She also wrote some fine poetry. This showed her to be a woman of introspection, perception, and great depth. Now, all three sisters were active members of Kilkenny Art Society in the 1950s and 60s. The society sponsored history debates, arranged art exhibitions, and brought many musical recitals to Kilkenny during this time. Rita collected and bound the reports of the history debates sponsored by the Society in the 1950s and presented them to Rothe House Library. A particular noteworthy event that Rita organised in 1961, when she was secretary of the Society, was a pageant by Standish O'Grady, the Mask of Finn, performed by the Old Charter Players in Callan. This took place during midsummer in Dunbellrath on Rice's farm and was followed by a feast of crubbeans and other delicacies. The evening got a rave review in the Irish press by Patrick Lanigan, who described it as a magical night with campfires burning and blazing torches. Benedict Kiley was literary editor of the Irish press during this time and wrote a column with Sean White under the joint pseudonym of Patrick Lanigan. They roamed around the country in the 60s, collecting articles and reports of interesting events and characters throughout Ireland. Rita was always available for artwork required by Rothe House. Promotion pamphlets and letters of appeal were set out by her and proved to be very effective. In 1966, when the house was being prepared for opening, she wrote all the labels for the museum exhibits. She was a great entertainer and an adventurous and creative cook. She was not afraid to put unusual ingredients together that few might have tried, but the flavors were always tantalizing. She spent Christmas Day at 25 Patrick Street from 1974 to 1989, and this was to be her last. These visits to Patrick Street were rewarded by invitations to her beloved home at Greensbridge, which was backed onto the River Nore and under the shadow of Hannes's Cathedral, to an always delightful meal. This is another watercolour of Rita's showing the Nore. On these occasions, the conversations were always lively and stimulating, with a few conspiracy theories of Rita's thrown in for good measure. The evening would start with a tot of sloe gin or strawberry vodka, made by her own hand, of course. Many of her colleagues and family members will fondly remember great evenings spent at her home. And I know a number of you watching tonight know exactly what I'm talking about. I have to mention, at Christmas too, her gifts for the children were always handmade with great skill. She would create fairy tale characters from papier-mâché to their delight. I remember her making a castle with strings hanging from the embrasures and turrets with their names with little surprises attached. These were intricate constructions which must have taken hours to prepare and make. Unfortunately for all of us, Rita died suddenly, aged 74. Like her sisters Mary and Kitty, she was a strong force in building a historic legacy for Kilkenny and in bringing about the resurgence of the arts and music in post-war Kilkenny, pioneering and paving the way for others to follow. It is now my great pleasure to hand you back to Helen, who will speak about her mother, Kitty. Helen was her only daughter, and she was the much-loved and only niece of Mary and Rita.
Thank you very much, Maura, for a very interesting account and for your very warm introduction to me again. So now I begin the story of Kitty's story. I begin Kitty's story. And she was at boarding school in Dublin at the Loreto Abbey Rathfarnham. And afterwards, she had a great experience in Cannes, studying French for a year in the convent of the Assumption. And she developed a love of the French language, which never left her. Now, this cleverly shot photo gives the impression that Kitty and her mother are actually piloting the plane. It must have been taken in the late 1920s when Mollie was paying a visit to Kitty in Cannes. Now, I'm showing you this family photograph taken 1925 or 1926 because it is one of the few photographs showing the 12-year-old Jim who stands behind his mother. Sadly, in 1933, 7 years after this photograph was taken, he was to die of tetanus. He had stepped on a nail and treated it at home. However, over a period of 10 days, his condition deteriorated, and despite desperate attempts to save him, he died in hospital at the age of 18, just after being awarded his matriculation qualification. His death had a profound effect on all the family, particularly, of course, his mother, who was to die the following year. So, from July 1934, the Hart sisters had to get on with their lives as best they could without the support of their mother. After qualifying as a dentist, Kitty did a postgraduate course in Glasgow, which I think related to children's dentistry. Initially, she had been drawn towards medicine, but to ease the financial burden on her parents, who still had 2 other children to educate, she eventually decided to study dentistry because it took a year less than medicine. She derived great satisfaction and enjoyment from her dentistry work. She was always fascinated by the intricate shapes of the human skull and jawbones. And why am I showing you this? She even brought this back from her honeymoon in Lugano. In 1933, Kitty decided to set up her own dental practice in Kilkenny. She managed this thanks to a gift of £100 from her uncle and godfather, Tom Grace, her mother's stepbrother. This was a large sum at the time and allowed her to buy all the equipment she needed to set up her dental surgery at 14 High Street. She has the distinction of being the first female dentist in the Irish Free State. Now, Kitty on her wedding day, and the wedding photograph with smiling faces all round. And my father, Tom Lanigan, had the broadest smile of all. Not only was he marrying his beloved Kitty, but this was the only time he acquired photographic proof that he was taller than his bride. Now, we move now to Winegap Cottage, because after her marriage, Kitty moved her practice to her home in Winegap Cottage on the Dublin Road, and later took up a post at the dental clinic in Friary Street, looking after children's teeth. This often involved a lot of travelling around the county. She soon found herself caught up in the legislation enacted during De Valera's time as Taoiseach, the infamous marriage bar, which forced women to retire from their jobs when they married. In Kitty's case, because the new Irish Free State really needed dentists, she was allowed to work in the dental clinic, even though she was married. But there was a snag. Her marriage status meant that her job would always be a temporary one. Every so often, a male dentist would apply for her post, would stay for a short while, and then move on. This meant that Kitty would lose her job every so often, but since none of the permanent dentists stayed very long, her gaps in service were usually short. However, when it came to her retirement, she and many other female dentists employed as temporary workers found themselves without a pension. After the death of her husband, this injustice was something she decided to act on. Helped greatly by her son Frank, she enlisted Mary Robinson to represent her at the Strasbourg court. She was looking forward to her day in court when the health authorities offered to settle the case by financial contributions to all the affected women dentists. This was accepted, and so Kitty missed her day in court. In 1952, an event happened involving the Kilkenny writer and scholar Hubert Butler, which caused Kitty great concern. I know you held an event in 2017 with a film and a thorough discussion about the 1952 controversy. I would just like to add a few words about Kitty Lanigan's role in persuading the Society in 1966 to invite Hubert Butler to become an honorary member of the Society. This was, she said, in recognition of his considerable achievements as honorary secretary and honorary editor of the Society in laying the foundations for the restoration of Roath House and the setting up of the museum there. Kitty was honorary curator at the time, and in her formal proposal at the AGM, she argued that this invitation would express the Society's appreciation for all his work as honorary secretary and editor, and make reparation to him for any damage to his reputation in 1952. It would also wipe out, she said, the false image of the Catholic Church presented in Kilkenny at that time. Her motion was unanimously passed, and Hubert became an honorary member of Kilkenny Archaeological Society. Shortly afterwards, in April 1966, Hubert and his wife Peggy joined in all the celebrations for the opening of Roath House. The writer and broadcaster Olivia O'Leary, in a recent radio programme, Sunday Miscellany, referred to a cartoon in which her grandfather, John O'Leary, featured at the time of this controversy. You can see halos seemingly representing the goodies and horns the baddies, but don't be carried away. Hubert Butler is undoubtedly in the dock, which is an unusual dock, and it's identified very clearly by kind permission in the little sign at the bottom, by kind permission of Louis. So that identifies it as the playpen of the Kenealy family. Now, the baddies may be those who came to Hubert's defense in this debacle, and the goodies who told the line. So here you can see what's happening. The fact that the people could be recognized so easily made it very amusing. And I think Rita and her wicked sense of humor would have got great enjoyment from doing this cartoon. Now, you might have seen this slide a few moments ago, but it has another purpose here. Because not only was it our home, of the family, but also that of John Banham. Kitty wrote no fewer than 21 articles for the Old Kilkenny Review, as well as 13 reports in her role as curator on Roath House Museum collection. After her marriage, Kitty and her family had lived for nearly 40 years in Winegap Cottage, and she began her research work by investigating the life of the novelist and painter John Banham, who had lived in the same house. In October 1949, Kitty gave her first lecture to the Society entitled John Banham in Winegap Cottage. And lo and behold, the script was published in full the following week in the Kilkenny Journal. A great coup for the Archaeological Society. I'm sure the fact that her sister Mary was married to the proprietor and editor of the Kilkenny Journal had absolutely nothing to do with it. The lecture was also published in the Old Kilkenny Review, the annual journal of the Society. In 1955, Kitty was commissioned to write another article on the Banham brothers for the Irish Times. The article highlights the aim of the two Banhams to win a place in English literature in their own right as native Irish writers. They felt that they knew and understood the common people, their daily lives and customs, and wanted to counteract the damaging effects of Irish people being represented as coarse and vulgar buffoons in some of the genteel novels of the time. I benefit from this article. The paper used my photograph of Winegap Cottage, and Mother, always very fair, gave me 10 shillings for my trouble. Earlier in 1962, the Kilkenny People had run another interesting article by Kitty on John Banham's school days in the English school in Roath House, although this was unattributed. So this is the first of 3 articles that Kitty wrote for the Kilkenny People. And this was the first one. The second one has quite an alluring subtitle, but it's of little use here. The story about the suitor had already appeared in the first article the previous week, so no bonus for the sub-editor that week. And this is the third one, obviously. Getting these articles serialized in the Kilkenny People was another coup for the Society, and this time without any handy relatives putting in a good word. And again, the lecture was published in the Old Kilkenny Review. Kitty collected John Banham's novels, often written with Michael, his brother, and bought this beautiful self-portrait miniature of John. In May 1977, the late Irish Times journalist Caroline Walsh wrote an excellent article on John and Michael Banham. Kitty would have given her some help, as she always replied to researchers looking for information about Kilkenny, and Caroline pays her a fitting tribute as someone who probably knows more about 2 brothers than anyone alive today. I'm sure since then, there are some PhD students who are hopefully making use of Mother's researches to help them with their projects. So Kitty Hart then and the Roath House. Kitty was heavily involved with the Roath House project and saw it through from beginning to end. Consultations, negotiations with the OPW, which to restore the house so excellently, consultations with committees of the Archaeological Society, legal work provided both pro bono by her husband. Under the leadership of Kitty and of Daisy Phelan, the Kilkenny Archaeological Society successfully accomplished this very ambitious project. Kitty was also involved with consultations leading to the Marquess of Ormond giving the wonderful gift of Kilkenny Castle to the state. She was also author of this first visitor guide about the castle, which was published by the Archaeological Society. After the opening of Roath House in 1966, Kitty met the need for a visitor's guidebook to the house. Her first booklet sold for 2 and 6pence and gave due credit to all involved in the restoration, particularly the architect Percy Leclerc and the clerk of works Louis Feely, both from the National Monuments branch of OPW. This booklet also contains this lovely little drawing of the Roath arms by Rita. It was reprinted, this booklet, many times, and along with the Kilkenny Castle booklet, has become a useful source of income for the society over the years. Armed with a good Russian camera, Kitty took thousands of photographs between 1958 and 1975 and kept a detailed catalogue entry for each photo. These historical and architectural records of Kilkenny's houses, windows, back streets, shop fronts, streetscapes and slips are an invaluable source of information for historians, architects and conservationists. They record the streets and buildings of Kilkenny before they were destroyed by what she viewed as uncontrolled development. Throughout her lifetime, Kitty was undoubtedly a fearless and vocal objector to any attempt by developer or council to tear down the old buildings of Kilkenny. Her youngest son was nominated to be her photographic assistant, and this meant somewhat reluctant early morning starts to catch the best light. Frank has made sure that this archive is stored in good environmental conditions, and with his daughter Susan, completed a thorough catalogue of the collection. It will be there for future generations. As we have seen, Kitty wrote extensively about the local history of the Kilkenny area and is still remembered today for her editorial role in the 1977 publication by the Kilkenny Association of An Taisce of Kilkenny, its architecture and history. She and Gerald Tyler, designer at Kilkenny Design Workshop, edited this together, Gerald concentrating on architecture and Kitty on history. Kitty's sister Mary was on a subcommittee along with Mary Balfe and Marjorie Brady to coordinate many contributions from local people. The book was beautifully designed by the distinguished North of England designer Richard Harte, who, with the late Rudolf Helsel, master goldsmith and jewellery designer, the artist and architect Eamon O'Doherty, the ceramicist Sonia Lanvier, and Gerald Tyner, designer and architectural historian, contributed so much to Kilkenny's cultural life while working at the Kilkenny Design Centre. Richard Eckersley, Rudolf and Eva Helsel, Sonia Lanvier, and the artist Barry Cook were on the original Kilkenny Arts Week committee and contributed enormously to the exciting ideas and high standards achieved by the Arts Week. With Rudolf, Helsel continued to curate exhibitions throughout his long time in Kilkenny. The foundations for today's success were laid a long time ago in the achievements of the Kilkenny Art Society, the Kilkenny Literary Society, the Kilkenny Art Gallery Society, and of course, the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. And long may Kilkenny's historic buildings and lively art scene continue to thrive, from the castle to the cathedral, with the medieval Mile Museum at St. Mary's Church, the Butler Gallery in its new home, and most importantly, Roath House with its gardens and its great Tudor architecture. May they all flourish in the future. Thank you very much.